Hello.
Hey, Rahul.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, good. Got your big week actually. Your first PR.
Yeah, no, first ever in the open source community at all. So
Oh man.
cool.
All right, we're gonna have to tweet about that. That only
Yeah.
happens once. Well, the interesting thing, or maybe the impressive thing about that, was that you had signed your commit. You tagged the issue, so that GitHub would auto close the issue.
hmm
I think you've been taking notes, and this is
Yeah. Been doing my homework.
Oh, nice. Okay. I'm gonna put the link to the meeting minutes in chat. Um, Everybody should have access to it. I'm gonna pull those up now while we wait for a few folks to join. All right, good. And then, as always, feel free to jump into the meeting minutes. Help me take notes as we go. Put your name down to record your attendance. I think we've got some folks pre-populated here. Okay. Yeah, a lot of activity in GitHub this week. Let me check Slack and see if other people said they weren't going to be able to make it. No, yeah, I think most folks will probably come. Okay. Nice. I just got done talking to Gunjan one-on-one a little bit earlier, so it was nice to be able to catch up face to face. Okay, good. So we lost Nikhil. Let me clean up these meeting minutes while we wait for a few others. So Ramesh was on. So Rahul, by the way, I don't know if you're. Yeah, I think I did mention that we've got a couple of other calls throughout the week that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it might. It sounds like they might conflict with kind of your day focus, but
Yeah. So a little bit.
sure. All right. So we've got workshops. Okay. So one thing is that Girish is out presenting at DevFest 2019 in Montreal today. That's good. He is, if you're not familiar with it, well, I know Raul is familiar with it, and most of the rest of you are, but the workshops that we give are out on the Layer 5 site. And so actually, if for any of you that haven't been through those, they're a self-paced workshop. And in this case, well, Girish has recently revised it to be a bit more centric to Meshery. So it ends up being that Meshery is really the tool that people use to walk through all these labs. And Meshery becomes a prerequisite to doing the labs. There's actually an enhancement that happened this week for Meshery to facilitate taking labs, and I'll show you guys that here in a little bit. And there's Gungeon. Okay. Nuno, great. And then hopefully let me paste the link to the meeting minutes again so folks can go in and and help me type while I talk and listen to you guys. Okay, good. We are about 5-6 minutes after, so let's get started. Some general announcements. This first one's actually a carryover, I think, from last week, where there will be a Forrester report coming out shortly that is going to highlight Meshery and really highlight the concept of multi-mesh, or multi-mesh manager, rather. That was kind of the language that they had used to describe Meshery, a multi-mesh manager. That's, in my mind, good language. We've been referring to Meshery as a management plane. This actually, since we have a bit of a smaller audience today, it might be worth taking a quick look at what I mean by a management plane. Maybe the way to do that is to go to that workshops link that I just put in there. There should be a link to Girish's slides that he'll be showing a little bit later today. Within there, we describe service mesh architectures. We say that, hey, in general, across all service meshes, or what makes up a service mesh is the data plane, a control plane. The control plane is that the implementation of the control plane is specific to the type of service mesh that's running. But beyond that is a management plane. And this concept is very familiar to network engineers. And as you've seen, as each of you have gotten into service meshes, that they're very networking centric. So this management plane is where a tool like Meshery resides. And so yeah, so that's what he's telling folks about. Since we're on the subject, maybe I had said that there'd been some enhancements made to make sure that people can walk through the workshop using Meshery. So Raul, did you in Guadalajara? Did you end up running Meshery at the time, or did you? I guess now I recollect the workshop that we went through in Guadalajara is actually different than the one that we normally give here.
Mm-hmm.
So it might actually, you might actually find this enlightening to kind of walk through this workshop, these labs.
Yeah, in the Guadalajara session, we only spoke about Meshery, but we did not go through the whole workshop of Meshery.
Okay. So good. So since we're on the topic, I'm going to pull up Meshery now. Each of you, if you're running Meshery, you should have you should already have the latest feature that I'm about to show you. I don't know if Meshery is running. So I'm just starting Meshery and signing in. Let me share my screen. Okay, going to Meshery, signing in. Okay, so within Meshery, as you all have used it today, under the area where you're able to configure the sample apps that have been deployed, there used to just be, I think, one configuration to apply, and now there are many, and these actually correlate to the steps in the labs in the workshop. So this workshop here, within the labs themselves, you end up applying a number of configuration rules to the mesh and to book info, the sample app. And now you're able to do those same steps through Meshery. And that's what Girish will be walking people through today. So it's a small enhancement, but that's nice that you're able to do a bit more specifically with Istio. So you guys will have to give that a try, and maybe in context of the workshops here. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions or comments on that new functionality? Nuno.
Quickly, sorry, I'm walking through the streets today, not in a train. So the configurations can they be also added? Not right now, but like to be adding some pre-config or custom configuration in the future.
Yep, totally. That you're on the right path. This is, and I think Nick just joined as well. So maybe just a quick recap for him. Just a recent enhancement in the Meshery Istio. The Meshery Istio adapter, where you're able to apply basically the sample configurations for book info, and we use this as a tool to drive the workshops. This is pretty inflexible, to Nuno's point, and needs to show the user the actual YAML that's being applied so they can be comfortable with it. And right now it doesn't, but there are features set up to do what you're describing, Nuno, which is for those that want to directly put in their own, paste in their own YAML, that they could do so to in Istio's case, to describe a new virtual service, kind of paste it in here and have it applied. In this case, this is gonna fail, but the UI needs to evolve well beyond that to make it such that, like, I think if anyone has used, if you've ever configured a firewall rule, or within within EC2 or really anywhere where you're using a visual interface to configure a firewall rule, that's probably what the visual interface for Meshery to configure these different types of rate limits and other things might end up looking like. And it gets a little long, actually, just because there's so many options to configure. The goal here is for people to ultimately visually configure their mesh and then take those configurations through a Git flow process. So yeah, Nuno, you hit it on the head.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, we can see that operation failed because it was invalid YAML. So. Okay, good. So maybe last thing on that particular topic is just to show that, let me stop sharing and share that a couple of things. One, not only has Raul joined us from Guadalajara, but so has Karen, who's not on the call here, but she's been doing some work around the logo design for Layer 5 and for Meshery as well. And I think many of you have been unfortunate enough to have your opinions solicited about, what you think, what type of a logo should we have. And so as a first step, we're trying to disambiguate Meshery, the project, from Layer 5, the community. And so it was a bit hasty, but we ended up, so this is just a quick snapshot of an hour ago at the Dev Fest in Ottawa. So there's a number of sponsors there, the CNCF, JFrog, and Layer 5, if you can barely make that out. So I'm excited to see that up. Let me share a different one. This is what it looks like, a little more up close, if I've got the right picture up. Yeah, there we go. So anyway, personally excited that your work is being represented today at the workshop. Meshery, I think, like I said before, is going to drive the workshop, so that's great. On this point, I really wish Karen was on because she's been providing a lot of these new designs. Let me share it maybe in the Slack channel or show what these might look like. Give me a moment. So, oh, wow. So a couple of these have been things like this design potentially for Meshery, but just using some of the same colors. Here's a different one potentially for layer 5 as a community, to just kind of take that 5 off and put that on the back of things. This is essentially what you were seeing printed out a moment ago. And so I think many of us, including Jill, who's on the phone, has been harangued and asked 900 times of what you think about the designs, because I have about as much indecision as any other human on this planet, I think, particularly on something that I consider to be very important. I don't know, in the end, maybe it's not. Nick, I have to say, HashiCorp's sleekness and the UX is inspiring. And when we think about a design like that, so there's a bit of hipness and sexiness that I think is associated with HashiCorp's logo. So.
You should see the early iterations. If you Google, you'll find some of the stuff back from 2012, and then kind of do a comparison between 2012 and 7 years later. There's a
significant, okay,
world of difference.
So
the old blue logo was
for Vagrant, or was it HashiCorp's?
Yeah, just the corporate brand in general. Let me see if I can find the link.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's actually it's actually very encouraging. It's probably the kind of thing that Jill likes to hear, because I think she's just sick of me asking, trying to figure this out. Is encouraging that, hey, we can just start, and if it needs to iterate over time, just like software, that can happen.
Yeah, 100%.
So as Nick looks for that logo, which is, I think we might all get a chuckle out of, I'm going to go back to sharing the minutes. I'm a bit disoriented this morning. I apologize. There are any number of things, actually, I think, to share and discuss. So a couple of things. A couple of weeks ago, the community had been relatively hard at work on the build and release process for Meshery itself. So we've switched from Travis CI over to GitHub Actions. Many of you that are on the call have helped take those GitHub Actions across all the repos. Things are being built very frequently. There's now a difference between the latest tag and releases themselves, which has helped facilitate actual releases of Meshery CTL. I'm gonna bring up the Meshery GitHub here. And when you go over to releases, now there are the artifacts that are being published on GitHub is just Meshery CTL, just the command line. The rest of the artifacts, the containers for running Meshery, those are still being published on Docker Hub. This project, the Layer 5 org, has been enabled for GitHub registry, GitHub packages, and to begin to potentially publish the Docker containers here. We haven't switched to that. I don't know that we're necessarily incented to do that, primarily because, more or less the world's Docker installations, the runtimes, the default registry is Docker Hub. I think it's just a little bit easier to go reference there. So the nice thing about that is that Kieran, who isn't on the call, but he had created a homebrew formula for Meshery CTL to just do a quick brew install Meshery CTL. Now that we've got versioned releases of Meshery CTL and those are happening and being released on GitHub, that formula can be stable and can land. So that's good. Nick, you didn't happen to find that logo, did you? Still,
the wrong button. I found a couple of things. It looks like are trying to wipe this out of the internet.
Oh, very good. Oh, I see. Okay, let me.
I'm just joking. But here's another. This is an interesting one as well, actually. But you can kind of see. So this would normally be on a white background. It's just a transparent image, but you can kind of see the everything's like all black now. It's just cleaner. This was the original like Vagrant logo back in sort of 2016, and now that come on, I'm gonna need to. Well, if you go to Vagrant's website, yeah, you see how it's kind of changed. It's just got a little simpler and a lot of so it stuff just kind of naturally iterates, like sticker wise as well. I can find my box of stickers. I think I've got some of the old HashiCorp stickers and some of the new ones, which is kind of nicely illustrates that stuff as well.
But I think you're right that a lot of times you'll see logos start relatively complex and just simplify over time. So Nuno, it looks like you got first dibs on stickers from what I tell. That's okay. Fair enough. We'll see what's happening by KubeCon. Okay. Actually, speaking of KubeCon, Nick, just given your involvement in Service Mesh Day or Service Mesh Con rather, any? I think talk acceptances and submissions and things were determined. Those were sent out. Are you able to share what any of the lineup potentially looks like? I don't know if that's been announced.
The schedule is somewhere. Bear with me. Whoops. Yeah. Sorry. I'm
yeah, no.
I'm just trying to. Is this the one? No.
Did you, in your mind, maybe another question would be that the meshes are relatively equally represented? Or
No, they're really not actually. There's like out of sort of I think about 10 tracks. There's one console talk. There's a kind of a couple of Linked, and it's pretty sort of heavily weighted, but I think that's kind of fine in some ways because it's all about what do you call it? I guess like consoles are pretty new to the market, so we're it's only really been this summer where we've had the features which would realistically you could want to run things in production. So it's a little bit, but
okay, and it's
not bad.
Is it? It's single track, right? It's just a single track day.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the more that there is to talk about and do within a given project, you would expect that the more heavily weighted submissions are about that. And, So actually,
yeah. I'm just trying to find. I've got a link. Why can I not find the link? I apologize.
This schedule that I'm sharing, I'm not sure if this is the same one that you're.
Oh, sorry. I'm looking at a different browser window. Yes, this is the one. Sorry. I'm glad you managed to find that, because I could not find it on their website. So I'm saying that they're not all biased. There's actually quite a couple of interesting sort of more generalized kind of talk, opposed to going direct in on stuff.
Right.
I did heavily lobby for a Meshery talk.
Oh, nice. And was there discussion around that, or was it mostly through votes?
Yeah, it was heavily political, to be honest with you, which I was a little bit kind of sad at. But I guess it's kind of understandable when you basically get a bunch of vendors to vote on talks. My personal perspective on that was I parked who I worked for and voted on talks on the merit of what I felt would be a benefit to the practitioner, rather than just kind of trying to promote HashiCorp and like throw shade on everyone else. So that was kind of interesting, but in some ways expected. I think in general, Service Mesh Con is something which probably should be bigger. It's kind of weird. You can't have the fringe event and then you have also Service Mesh talks at the main KubeCon. So I don't know. I don't know what the orientation on that will be next year. But have you also seen that the CFPs are open for the Palo Alto event?
No.
Bear with me. Finding link.
Huh. Is this like with respect to Twistlock being involved? Or?
So this Palo Alto Networks. Sorry, I'm having to find a link because I really I've got no memory whatsoever. Are running. Let's look. A thing called Cloud Native Live Evolving Security, which is all around sort of security teams, but actually Service Mesh is probably going to take sort of quite a bit of focus on that. I would think, considering it's fast becoming a very favorite sort of. I think there's also relevant opportunity there for Meshery, because ultimately, if you are running a service mesh, being able to kind of evaluate, maybe being able to test, being able to kind of run a bunch of debugging and things like that, there's I think there's a good fit if you were thinking of submitting.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, okay, and so this is at KubeCon as well. All right, interesting. Okay, good. Yeah, and so Twistlock is part and parcel to it. Okay, yeah. Nick, maybe we want to. I know you don't have enough to do at KubeCon, so maybe we want to brainstorm something there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even trying to think of KubeCon right now. It's so far into so many hurdles ahead of where I am right now. I'm just kind of
you're just probably recovering from Actually, Nick, can you enlighten us about now that you're on the other side of HashiConf, about all of the fantastic the Azure things.
Yeah, so I think a bunch of good stuff at HashiConf. So we didn't have any new features for console because, well, direct features for console, from the 1.6 release that we brought out in the summer, but we did go GA 1.6, which introduces all the layer 7 configuration. Kind of one of the biggest announcements is that we're partnering with Microsoft. And what we're doing with Microsoft with that partnership is bringing managed console to Azure. So anybody who wants to run console, I'm predominantly probably in service mesh mode rather than just kind of vanilla service discovery and stuff, can now do so. And HashiCorp will kind of look after the management of those servers. So you don't need to do anything. You just kind of click a button and you get endpoints that you can then use with your existing infrastructure. So where kind of my take on like why that's really, really important is heterogeneous environments. So if you're using Kubernetes and pure Kubernetes, then that's awesome. But the kind of certainly larger enterprises, and I think a lot of people are still in this migratory step. So one of the things that kind of HashiCorp are trying to enable folks is to do that easy migration. So for example, with console service mesh and the new gateways features that we introduced, you could run a single console service mesh, which is broken up of a number of data centers. So for example, I could run data center 1, which is going to be my virtual machines, and I can run data center 2, which is my Kubernetes. So for example, I have an application which is running in virtual machine, and I want to migrate that to the cloud, specifically into Kubernetes. Then you potentially have to do a big bang approach. You've got to lift and shift all of the dependencies of that application and put them into Kubernetes, and that is complicated and it carries risk. However, if you leverage a service mesh, then what you can actually do is deploy the application to Kubernetes, and your traffic can be seamlessly routed between your virtual machines and Kube without having to worry about flat networks, NAT, or any sort of VPN connection, because the gateway handles all of that. But the other benefit of using service mesh is you can also start doing things like canaries. So for example, if I want to move my payment service from my VMs to Kubernetes, I can set everything up inside of Kubernetes. I've got my existing infra running on my VMs, and then I can configure traffic splitting so that I'm actually pushing a percentage of my live traffic to Kubernetes, the bulk of it being handled by my virtual machines. And it gives me the ability to do that kind of gradual deployment or gradual migration, which, having been on the rough end of that stick and having to do a big bang approach before, I really wouldn't want to do it again. But there just was no tooling at the time, so we're pretty excited about that. I think like console works really good in Azure, and I would kind of, without saying too much, definitely say watch that space.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I'm not gonna take your or yeah. I guess this is a pretty small call. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, for the valuation that an organization like HashiCorp has, and of those that have got deep, and this isn't necessarily what you're saying, but deep enough pockets to. Anyway, it's a great relationship. You can see why Microsoft is also very friendly to Buoyant and to Linkerd and kind of a similar motion and etc. And so. Anyways, so congrats. It was fantastic to see you up on stage talking about meshy things as you've done.
Yeah, that was a kind of a last minute request.
It's enough to make a person older. It's
I'm telling you, it's making me a lot grayer.
Yeah. Well, so good. So guys, I know Nikhil, Anand, Ashish, Gunjan, Chaim, Raul. Some of you guys have met Nick in the past, but if just to the extent that you're not aware, I mean, so Nick is employed at HashiCorp, I think, wears probably a couple of different hats. Certainly one of them as an advocate of the product, but also this is something that I've been a bit vocal about Nick, and I think most of the rest of you. Chaim is a good example of someone whose paycheck comes from a vendor and is trying to do right by being loyal to is trying to do right all around. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about service mesh interface. It's an API abstraction across service meshes. So Nick certainly represents well and even-handedly and equally, and recognizing that we're in a sort of embracing the open source way and that we're in a smaller community. And I think Chaim has shown similar behavior as well, which I think it's one of those things that sometimes it hurts in the short run because interests weren't, because you didn't stick your elbows out and make sure that your personal interests weren't the best represented, but in the long term is the winning strategy from my perspective. So I didn't want to talk about SMI, service mesh interface, that much, but to say that Hamlet, or the other somewhat related project from VMware, so we had caught up with Sergio. Let me bring up the announcement so that everyone's familiar with this abstraction that VMware had announced at VMware World just a couple of weeks ago. So open service mesh interoperability collaboration, which it would be really funny if the public-facing acronym for this eventually was OpenSMI. So I think I know we talked about this on the call previously, but I think we do talk about a number of things that are abstract enough that are probably worth repeating a bit. Moreover, I'm going to be asking some of you to assist in this regard. So like Nick had said before, Sergio, this gentleman is a nice guy, actually, and moreover, what he and some others, and Nick included, are trying to accomplish is a bit of a specification that abstracts and helps federate multiple service mesh deployments, and helps, well, in some respects, I think you might be able to characterize it as sort of service discovery for service meshes, like the ability to, in a uniform way, speak to a service mesh and say, what are you capable of? And to a different one, what are you capable of? And help them interoperate a bit. It's a bit of a different initial vector or perspective angle from which this effort is being drawn up as compared to SMI, which I'll
I think the kind of the key, the sort of the key difference, what SMI does is it proposes a high level abstraction interface, whereas the VMware initiative is all about low level. It's kind of a specification for low level connectivity between service meshes. So how do you kind of share service catalog, as you were explaining, how do you share service catalogs, and how do you share and sort of federate identity, because obviously MTLS requires certificates. So being able to validate identity cross service mesh. What I think is really exciting about all of this is kind of directional, and it's sort of like the industry is saying, hey, you probably won't just have one service mesh, in the same way that you don't just have that you're operating Kubernetes and you're operating virtual machines, and And ultimately, for you to get your work done, they all need to play nice. And yeah, I think it's interesting. I was actually, just as a side note, I was actually just speaking with Sergio this morning around SMI and trying to encourage VMware to get involved. And kind of one of the things that sort of Sergio was saying is that, like, maybe it's a little early for a specification. And I'm like, well, maybe, but like, if we think about it now, then we can save ourselves a lot of pain later. I mean, yes, features are evolving, but as a group, if we can kind of agree on the interfaces now, we kind of save a whole load of pain later when there is a convergence in the industry. But the other thing, which I'm probably going to get totally flamed for by certain folks next week on the SMI call, but I'm going to say it anyway because I don't mind. Is posing the concept of whether SMI is a Kubernetes centric interface or whether it is just a service mesh interface.
Yeah.
Because theoretically, there's no reason at all that you couldn't interact directly with console using SMI as an interface to configure the various different things without that being run on Kubernetes. And certainly for the folks in VMware with NSX SM, that's obviously an important
Yeah, I agree with you. I was going to try to pull up the issue in GitHub on the SMI repo, where I don't know, Brendan and someone else were chatting, and it was like I had said, well, that makes sense if this is only going to be a Kubernetes thing, and then I went back to reread the intro to SMI, which says this is for Kubernetes or such and such, and it's a bit of it just continues to give service meshes like console a good breathe more life into console. Because the other 80% of the world's workloads that aren't on service mesh, so Sergio had so he reached out earlier this week to say, hey, let's re-engage, and I will learn a lot more about Meshery. It sounds like we're really well aligned. We had a great initial conversation, and that he had hinted that maybe there was more overlap, or he was considering that maybe there's a bit more overlap with SMI than he had originally considered. And I, in some respects, I guess I haven't given it a ton of thought, but it might almost be nicer if they continue to be two separate things. This is, I think, coming from a self-biased perspective, and also a recognition that, and also the perspective that specifications can be really slow-moving things, particularly when there are many, many vendors involved. And so, in part, I say that to say that there's a lot in there to be done, and if one of the things that I understood that VMware's specification was trying to get right was this sort of a way of representing capabilities of one mesh to the next, or a catalog of, it's sort of exchanging, here's what's available, here's what's not. And if that's focused in inter-cluster or in a federated type way, that the two can relatively coexist and may be able to evolve a bit more quickly independently than they would necessarily together. I am pleased to see that VMware spec did get announced, which finally kicked Microsoft in the pants to actually have a call, 6 months later, or 4 months later. So I know that Nick and I have been talking about this, and hopefully folks are picking some of this up. That there is a specific thing that I wanted to describe with respect to service mesh interface that seems to resonate a fair bit. It resonates not only with SMI with respect to Meshery, but it also resonates with the VMware spec, and it could be work that this community could pick up. The work is around the notion that it's around conformance and compliance testing. And it's this, and we talked about it a fair bit, Nick, last SMI call, but it is, well, it's a notion that anytime you put out a specification, and vendors or communities or what have you go to implement to that specification, that you'd ideally be able to test whether or not the implementation conforms to the spec. And so most of the time that you see a specification come forth, SNMP, HTTP, think protocols and these types of things. When you think of Kubernetes and all of the organizations that have implemented behind its APIs, well, there's conformance testing that goes on as vendors go to produce their own Kubernetes distributions and things. Anytime you have a spec, you have conformance tooling. Cloud events is another example. There's been what seemed like a fair bit of ask and agreeance around a tool like Meshery that's really aimed at some of the same, all of the same goals as SMI and VMware spec to be a compliance or a conformance testing tool.
I wonder, Lee, I think there's something which has been brought up a couple of times as well, which I think could be really, really incredible for Meshery to drive, and that is, so if you remember kind of a couple of SMI calls ago, I had the goal to question whether SMI was lowest common denominator or not, and received a little bit of flack but my kind of concept around that is that, like, I think that problem could be solved. So SMI is about configuration inbound, but what about that outbound feature discovery? Is that covered by the VMware spec, or is that covered by something that like SMI should build in the same way as traffic metrics allow you to kind of discover metrics? Should there be a formal part of the spec somewhere which allows you to describe what features are supported? And the reason that I sort of say that is because for a tool like Meshery, if you didn't have to maintain an internal list of is traffic splitting supported in console, you can build a much nicer, tighter integration from a practitioner's stance. And if service mesh interface is always just going to be lowest common denominator, then okay, you don't need that. But I feel that I feel quite strongly that folks need comprehensive kind of a comprehensive interface which allows them to do like their daily tasks. Mm-hmm. Having a kind of a mix and match of 2 or 3 different worlds is counterproductive. But regardless, I think even from a application integration perspective, so maybe that's something worth tabling as kind of a concept for the next call, and saying, can we have a definition of a discovery interface which just kind of says these features and those features are supported by the various different meshes and the various different versions of meshes as well, right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that. Well, so before I go off and describe how it is that I agree, let me say that. I'd like to have a win, or we have a relatively small community of Meshery only moves so quickly at the moment, and it'd be nice to have a win, maybe around anything, whether it was the compliance tool or this. The compliance stuff might be smaller in nature. It's certainly less inflammatory than the other suggestion around lowest common denominator. Yeah, I thought that it was a bit disappointing that So for those on the call, the question that was posed was, is a specification like SMI to describe only the features that all meshes support, or would it facilitate quote unquote proprietary features of each mesh? And the first approach of lowest common denominator, I think, has the benefit of being universally, or rather, you would, as you go to interface with SMI, the experience will be consistency, uniformity. People will readily call into question, and I think that they will probably call into question the value of a service mesh behind that, or to facilitate load balancing or some of these things, traffic splitting, because they would say, well, I'm having to run all this additional infrastructure, run this additional layer, understand this stuff, update it as it goes, rather than just using the ELB, the load balancer in front of it and updating its config. And like, this is just what's the benefit? If it's so low that the power of these meshes and the auto instrumentation, these other features that you get, I think that it's a lot more interesting, and it's a lot more helpful to have what's more or less a common interface, but the one that dynamically says, oh, I've recognized that you're running a particular type of infrastructure, and as such, I'll go ahead and expose a couple of new knobs to you, or I'll tell you these are the knobs that are available or aren't, and those knobs, it's the same knob, it's the same looking interface. So you gain the benefit of both worlds. And I'll digress for a second and say a big reason why I wholeheartedly embrace that philosophy is because I built a team of just less than 100 folks at Cisco, and we built out Cisco's cloud management platform. And I think it might still be being released. It's probably in sustaining mode, but it was anyway. The point of that software was essentially the same thing. It provided people a common user interface to run public and private clouds on top of OpenStack, AWS, vCloud Director, blah, blah, on top of many different types of infrastructure. You as a user had no clue as to what the actual infrastructure behind the scenes was. And for that particular product, that was part of the point. That was, but that doesn't have to be the point here. But when you as a user, or when your deployment was done on top of ESXi or vCenter, there were quite a few things that you got to do as a user. If it was deployed on top of OpenStack, there were lesser, but the experience was the same. You just either got more or less. So yeah, I certainly believe in that. I believe in building out a compatibility matrix in the table. In part, I'm hoping that the landscape, sort of the layer 5 landscape, kind of builds towards that. I'll speak for myself and say my attention is way too divided to accomplish some of these like really meaningful things. I'm totally on board. I will be open with you and say that I'm not sure if I'm willing to expend my political capital on, or I was disappointed that there was a response that basically the other vendor on the call was saying, well, these things don't make sense, and mostly because they didn't have those capabilities. It was like so the other way of encouraging this and saying let's do that suggestion is, it's not that we shouldn't bring it up, but potentially to begin to work through that here or somewhere, or anywhere other than within that meeting directly, or like bring it up and mention it and say there's merit, and do the right thing by bringing it up. And to the extent that there isn't traction, continue forth with that, and maybe bring it back when it's pretty hard to deny, or drive that within Sergio's thing, if that's and so I wonder, Nick, if go ahead.
I mute myself. I think that it could work the other way around as well, right? I mean, Sergio's thing could could be integrate with SMI to be able to give you a kind of a list of features which but yeah, I think Sergio's had some really good points this morning, and some of his points were like, I kind of went through a lot of this stuff like 10 years ago, he was saying, when people were talking about configuring firewalls and things like that, and the space was just so kind of open, and oh gosh, now he knocked something off my desk, and that it needed like a couple of years for the market to consolidate around a sort of a fewer sort of set of products to be able to kind of get the conversations, but which I see his point, but my kind of point is that we work in a slightly different world now. We are a lot more open. I mean, there is no way on this planet that Microsoft and Google would have had a deep and meaningful conversation around the specification 10 years ago. Well, maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
Everybody wanted to be the vendor of the specification.
Right.
But now I think we have a more open dialogue, and kind of my point to Sergio is I don't disagree about the consolidation and the evolution that's happening, but actually agreeing these things now as a kind of a group protects everybody, because if NSXSM has a new feature and I look at that and I'm like, well, that's an amazing feature, like we will copy that one day. Mm-hmm. It's actually nice to be able to say, well, hey, I'm tabling this SMI specification for my feature that nobody else has, and it's my but ultimately folks would look at that and go, well, that makes sense in the space. Someday I'd like to build that feature, and being able to kind of contribute early to what that specification looks like means that you do get to build against the spec when you build it, yourself. So you're kind of implementing a standard later in time. You're defining the standard before you implement the feature, kind of thing. Yeah. Which I think is beneficial for the community, because I do genuinely think that a lot of service meshes the core functionality is going to be the same, because the service mesh as a concept is heavily bounded by like what you really want to do with it, and that's kind of like like network reliability, observability, and security. There's a whole host of stuff under the hood, such as where it runs, what it can integrate with, what is the performance, what is the kind of the level of security. Can you kind of derive your certificates from a HSM, or is it just purely kind of code-based? Maybe you don't even sort of support and I think those are the features which are going to give the vendors the specific drive in the space. I think feature-wise, like Istio is kind of the most mature feature set right now. Like everybody is going to implement the most sane parts of those of those features, and but that's not going to be Istio's kind of unique selling point. It's going to be like scale or performance, or the fact that it's just already available in Kubernetes, which I think is a possibility that the Kubernetes project might determine and say, hey, we need to we almost need service mesh in the same way as we need service discovery, and who knows, but
I think to the extent that Istio is as large as it is, that has probably prevented the absorption of service mesh into Kubernetes, and that what's helped that is the number of implementations of it. That then, unlike a Helm or some other tool that's just has born out of Kubernetes and is specific to Kubernetes, that I think as we go to end the call here, I'm reminded that I'm reminded that I've got a little bit of work to go do to finalize the proposal for SIG network in the CNCF, which I've tried to describe to Sergio, and I'm gonna have to ask him if it's Sergio or Sergio or but Sergio. I don't know. Anyway,
I would Sergio, but he's never been polite. He's either so polite that he's never corrected me, or
Yeah. But we're gonna have a deep dive. So we're scheduled for a deep dive on SIG network at KubeCon, even though we haven't formed the SIG just yet. But point being is to reflect on some of the things you'd said. That even if those, I think if you reflect on open census and open
tracing.
Thank you, and how they've come together under open telemetry. That
open metrics.
Well, no, open No, you're right. Open tracing and open census as being like competitive to the extent that open tracing was there for some time, and people had implemented toward it. And open census comes out and it's kind of auto instrumenting a number of other things, bringing other metrics. It's not just distributed tracing. Anyway, ended up coming into open telemetry. Possible for something like that to happen with these two.
And I think there's hints to some stuff like this. I mean, looking at like some of the new API v2 ingress in Kubernetes, there are definitions inside of the Kube network experimental namespace for defining things like traffic splitting.
Got it.
So there's there's therefore a sort of an element of crossover. I know you got to bounce, but dude, I'd love a like a 101 on SIG networking if you've got a half hour next week.
Yeah,
I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah. Let's do it. And since we're over, and I want to be respectful. So Gunjan, it was nice to catch up one-on-one with you just earlier. So this is great. Ashish, you guys are putting out the PRs faster than I can close them, actually. So thanks for that. There are, if any of you guys know Rohit, if you see him, poke him, tell him we miss him here, because that guy was moving fast. We'd love to keep him engaged. And then Chaim, I think hey, we landed your docs. I think we're ready to go from beta to stable and have Octarine adapter be part of anytime anyone downloads the. Actually, Chaim, I don't know. I was going to suggest that we were giving a workshop and that we update the workshop to include Octarine, and I remembered actually we don't have Linkerd or console or anything else in there because it's an Istio workshop, but it is exciting that the workshop does use Meshery and everyone will have Octarine sitting right there.
All right.
Well, good. Anybody have any last minute things before we end? I feel bad. It is Friday and it's like really late night Friday for some of us.
Hello, sir.
Gunjan. Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Go ahead, Gunjan.
Sir, actually, you have assigned me a work that is, I have to organize the adapters alphabetically. So I am looking for the code. So that was nap.html. So there are something like grandchild.url and child URL, node.url. So I'm not getting where is the code. So I have to edit those codes.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to remember the framework that we're using for these docs. So your goal is to organize these alphabetically, as opposed to insinuating that console is the most important by putting it first.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're asking. Let me do a bit of homework and come back to you, because I'm not sure what Ruby is doing this on the back end, or like what.
Okay, sir.
So let me. I'll hit you up here a little bit later today with some info.
Okay, sir. I will ping you.
Okay, very good. Let me let everyone go and see you guys next week. Thanks for the good discussion today.
Great to see you all. Later.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye,
Bye.
sir.
Bye-bye.